Good evening again to all of you. My name is Octavian Gabor, and I'm a professor of philosophy here at the College of Arts and Sciences. It is my great honor to introduce to you Dr. Randall Poole, professor of intellectual history and director of Health Humanities program at the College of St. Scholastica in Duluth, Minnesota. He has obtained his PhD at the University of Notre Dame, and his research areas include Russian and European intellectual history, the history of ideas, and the history of philosophical and religious thought. Dr. Poole is a translator and editor of Problems of Idealism, Essays in Russian Social Philosophy, and co-editor of 5 other volumes, most recently the Oxford Handbook of Russian Religious Thought and Law and the Christian Tradition in Modern Russia. He is a fellow of the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University, Atlanta, Georgia, and a fellow of the International Center for the Study of Russian Philosophy at the Institute of Philosophy and Pittsburgh State University. And in 2012, he was visiting professor of the Russian Intellectual History at the University of Toronto. He has held research fellowships at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New York University, Stanford University, Columbia, and elsewhere. He is also the author of many articles and book chapters on Russian intellectual history, philosophy, and religion. And most of all, Randall is a wonderful person who remains in the souls of all who meet him. And I trust that his words today will bring beacons of beauty into your souls. Dr. Randall Poole, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much, Tommy. Thank you so much, Tommy. Yes? No?
No, you're good.
Oh,
Now
there
you're
we
good.
go.
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right. Tommy, that was very, very generous. I am delighted to be here at Methodist College. I am very grateful to all of you who made my visit possible. My talk this evening comes from my experience as the founding director of the Health Humanities program at the College of St. Scholastica. Tommy mentioned that, that my primary area of research and expertise is Russian intellectual history. So you may wonder how I made the transition from Russian intellectual history to health humanities. I'm a historian of Russian philosophy, and within Russian philosophy, my research is focused on the history of the idea of human dignity. Human dignity is the central value of the health humanities, and so I have the kind of philosophical wherewithal based on my training in Russian intellectual history to make a fairly smooth transition to health humanities. I know that Methodist College is considering establishing a program in health humanities, so it may be that some of my remarks this evening will be relevant to that initiative here at Methodist College, and I would be very happy to help in any way that I can with establishing that prospective program here. So everyone should have, I hope, a fairly detailed handout outline. I prefer to use, because I'm old-fashioned, I prefer to use paper handouts as opposed to PowerPoint presentations. This gives you something to take home with you this evening. So my lecture this evening is about 45 minutes or so. The first part of the lecture presents an overview of the field of health humanities, and then the second part of the lecture delves into some of the central philosophical problems against which health humanities as a field responds. So the title of my talk, Health Humanities: Responses to a World in Suffering. So the central imperative of healthcare is to relieve suffering, to promote healing, to restore, preserve, and improve health. The subjects of these high purposes are, of course, human beings, and therefore it is clear that effective healthcare rests on a sound understanding of human beings, of what it is to be human. Over the past 50 years, the field of health humanities has developed out of the recognition that the humanities provide a distinctive type of knowledge and understanding that is essential to healthcare. They, the humanities, provide skills, sensitivities, and perspectives that are different, but no less important than the competencies of medical science and biomedical knowledge. They, the humanities, represent a vast resource for a more humane approach to medicine through their insight into the human condition, through their understanding of the humanity of everyone involved in healthcare. Patients, first of all, but also healthcare providers and professionals. More specifically, the humanities teach us that suffering, healing, and health are not only physical or biological realities, but human experiences that cannot be understood by natural scientific methods alone. The humanities teach us about human well-being and flourishing, about meaning and value, and about human dignity and personhood. Further, the humanities teach us skills of observation, analysis, communication, critical thinking, discernment, empathy, and self-reflection, all of which are essential to humane healthcare and health promotion. Health humanities is a rapidly growing interdisciplinary field. In its current form, the field started to take shape in the 1970s, first of all in major medical schools. The first department of humanities in a medical school was established in 1967 at Penn State University's Hershey Medical School. The terms medical humanities and bioethics gained currency in the 1980s. In 1988, the Institute for the Medical Humanities was founded at the University of Texas Medical Branch at Galveston. 10 years later, the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities was formed from 3 prior organizations. They were the Society for Health and Human Values, which had been founded in 1969, the Society for Bioethics Consultation, which was founded in 1986, and the American Association for Bioethics, founded in 1994. Increasingly, health humanities is preferred as the broader, more inclusive term, though it has not displaced medical humanities. Recently, the field has begun to be offered as an undergraduate program while retaining its place in medical and graduate school curricula. How am I doing so far? Okay, all right. So I'll carry on. Health humanities emerged in response to an enduring overemphasis on biomedical science and technology in clinical practice, to trends of dehumanization and depersonalization in modern medicine, and to reductive or scientistic, that's scientific as distinct from scientific, approaches which flatten human beings to biochemical processes. Instead, the field of health humanities offers holistic approaches which recognize that human beings are persons, complex wholes of body, mind, and soul. This emphasis on human personhood and on human dignity, on the intrinsic and absolute worth of being human, is one of the philosophical foundations of health humanities, the basis of their opposition to biomedical reductionism. What is most distinctive about human beings is that we are persons, ends in ourselves who ought never to be treated merely as means. This, again, is the philosophical ground of the health humanities. It is also my most important theme this evening. How medicine and health professions conceive, represent, or see human beings decisively affects how patients are treated. It makes a difference whether the patient is seen mainly as a diseased or dysfunctional body, or as a whole person who happens to be ill. The aim of health humanities is to provide humane care for the whole person beyond biomedical knowledge, as important as that knowledge is. Reducing medicine, healthcare, and public health to science and technology risks dehumanization, as do even more directly materialistic conceptions of the human being. These dangers are real. At their worst, they led, by the late 19th century, to social Darwinism and so-called scientific racism, to the eugenics movements of the early 20th century, to Nazi medicine, and to war and genocide, to research exploiting vulnerable groups, such as the infamous U.S. Public Health Service's Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male. That was a 40-year study that ran from 1932 to 1972. We could discuss it in more detail if you'd like after the text of my lecture. Today, the dangers of biomedical reductionism are evident in the social denial of death and its medicalization, and even in the medicalization of human life as a whole. To counter these dangers, the health humanities strive for integrated, holistic, and ethical approaches. These approaches underpin primary and patient-centered healthcare. They better enable us to understand the social determinants of health and to learn from the voices of marginalized communities as well as from individual experiences within them. In 1982, the prestigious New England Journal of Medicine published an article by Eric Cassell. It was titled, "The Nature of Suffering and the Goals of Medicine." The article has since been widely read, and in 1991, the article was expanded into an important book under the same title. In his article, Cassell, who's a physician, wrote the following: "Suffering is experienced by persons, not merely bodies." He defined suffering as, quote, "the state of severe distress associated with events that threaten the intactness of the person," end quote. Modern medicine, he wrote, can actually increase suffering. This is a consequence, he explained, of Cartesian mind-body dualism. That's a concept to which I will return in a few minutes. Even more destructive to an integral concept of the person are materialism and related ideologies, such as naturalism and scientism. They do away altogether with the concept of the person. So with dualism and materialism, the patient is depersonalized and suffering increases. That's Cassell's thesis. Since the main obligation of the health professions is to relieve suffering and to promote healing, the restoration of wholeness, it is clear that we need to understand persons and their experiences, not just bodies and their diseases and dysfunctions. In caring for persons, both the health sciences and the health humanities are essential, but for different reasons. Let me try to describe their different methodologies. The natural sciences work with the physical world, with what can be empirically observed, measured, and tested. They study the impersonal, objective world of particles, atoms, molecules, cells, organisms, and bodies, the structures and laws of physical objects and events. It is clear that the health sciences have a crucial role when it comes to the physical bodily aspects of the human being. But we are not merely bodies. In fact, our non-physical aspects are what make us distinctively human. This dimension of human being includes feelings, emotion, thought, meaning, value, and belief. the entire inner world of human experience, self-consciousness, and mind. Because it is internal and personal, human experience cannot be directly observed. Therefore, it is not accessible by natural scientific methods. It is the world of the humanities. Though it cannot be observed, human experience can be understood, and understanding it is the task of the humanities, including the health humanities, which are specifically concerned with suffering and healing as human experiences. Humanistic understanding comes, at least most fully, from the word. Human experience takes shape, is communicated and understood through language. Other animals are sentient and they have experiences, but human beings interpret their experiences and give them meaning. Human beings are creatures of meaning, not content in simply meeting physical needs. We have various forms of cultural expression or ways of expressing meaning, but verbal communication is basic to human understanding. The key concept in this connection is narrative. With it, narrative, we connect our experiences into meaningful wholes in relationship to ourselves and to others. Fundamentally, the humanities seek to understand human experience and meaning, and narrative is essential to their task, since human experience itself remains hidden, private, and unobservable. Narrative is the human way of knowing, the way persons understand themselves and each other. Such knowledge and understanding can in turn deepen our experience of reality and the meaning we find in it. Is the handout that you have helpful in following what I'm saying? I know some of this is rather dense, so I thought that a detailed handout would help you to follow it. Now, one of the essential distinctions in health humanities is between disease as a physical condition and illness as human experience. The health humanities approach illness, disability, suffering, healing, aging, and dying as human experiences, and they use narrative to better understand them. Rita Sharon is professor of clinical medicine and director of the program in narrative medicine at Columbia. She writes the following: along with scientific ability, physicians need the ability to listen to the narratives of the patient, grasp and honor their meanings, and be moved to act on the patient's behalf. This is narrative competence, she says. That is competence that human beings use to absorb, interpret, and respond to stories, end quote. This competence, she continues, enables the physician to practice medicine with empathy, reflection, professionalism, and trustworthiness. Such a medicine can be called narrative medicine, end quote. Narrative competence is closely related to other essential skills in health humanities, such as discernment, insight, and empathy. Since a person's experience of illness and of health is highly dependent on his or her culture, it is clear that cultural understanding is another critical area of health humanities. Narrative and cultural competence go hand in hand. Both are necessary for effective, humane healthcare. What are the main health humanities disciplines? They largely coincide with the humanities more generally. Areas like cultural and language studies, literature, history, philosophy, theology and religious studies, and the arts. Let me take just three: literature, philosophy, and history. The importance of literature is already clear by my remarks about narrative medicine. The study of literature provides an understanding of experience that is not our own. This is critical, since the only human experience to which we have direct access is our own. Literature is a source of vicarious human experience. It helps us to understand the inner lives of others and to develop skills in interpreting the experience of others. It cultivates empathy and moral reflection, all essential tasks for person-oriented healthcare. One classic form of narrative is biography. The philosopher Holmes Ralston III has defined personhood itself in terms of biography. Only persons have an individual, unique biography. Constructing or narrating one is part of what it means to be a self. Philosophy, too, is a central health humanities discipline. Here, its main problems include human nature, human potential and the conditions for its realization, human powers such as reason and free will and their ontological or metaphysical implications, and personhood and human dignity. Philosophy also concerns itself with the meaning of human health in relation to ideals of well-being, flourishing, and happiness. Nothing less than the meaning of life and death is a philosophical problem and a perennial one. Within philosophy, there is the subfield of the philosophy of medicine. Biomedical ethics has assumed great importance in recent decades with the now widely accepted principles, bioethical principles of autonomy, non-malfeasance, beneficence, and justice. The history of medicine is a specialization within intellectual history, my own area, the history of medicine, focuses on medicine as a field of human inquiry and knowledge. This includes the history of ideas of health and disease, such as the humoral, miasmatic, and pathogenic theories of disease, the work and influence of great figures in the history of medicine, such as Hippocrates and Galen, and more modern figures such as Pasteur and Virchow, and the conditions, social and intellectual, of medical progress. More broadly, there is the history of disease and its impact on society, and the social and cultural contexts of the manifestation of disease and the experience of illness. The history of medicine is the oldest of the health humanities disciplines. It emerged at the end of the 19th century. One of its pioneers was Sir William Osler, Canadian-born professor of medicine at the Johns Hopkins University. Then he was Regius Professor of Medicine at Oxford and one of the most influential physicians in the English-speaking world. He said, quote, "The good physician treats the disease, but the great physician treats the patient who has the disease," end quote. Nurses are rather better at this, as Osler himself recognized, writing around 1900 that, quote, this is from a physician, "The trained nurse has become one of the great blessings of humanity, taking a place beside the physician and the priest, and not inferior to either in her mission," end quote. This was an acknowledgement of the remarkable work of Florence Nightingale in England and Dorothea Dix in the United States. Osler feared the further dehumanization of medicine with the rise of the German Model Research University. In response, he articulated the holistic ideal of humanitas, or humanistic education, and looked to history for the development of a humane and person-oriented medicine, a historically minded medical humanism. Osler may well have been right to fear the dehumanizing consequences of German science and medicine. But in fact, it was German theorists of history, such as Wilhelm Dilthey who in the late 19th century first rigorously distinguished between the external object-oriented methodologies of the natural sciences and the inner subject-oriented methodologies of the humanities. Dilthey used the term verstehen, or understanding, to critique positivism and scientism as a universal model of knowledge, and to capture the distinctiveness of the humanities. The German term for humanities or human sciences is Geisteswissenschaften, which he argued must be grounded in the connection among lived experience, Erleben, expression, Ausdruck, and understanding, again, Verstehen, much along the lines that I outlined above. In the late 19th century, the emergence of a humanistic history of medicine was a response to the materialistic conception of the human being that had developed since the scientific revolution. If you're following along on the handout, this will take us to Roman numeral 4, materialism in the history of medicine. Recall that I referred to Eric Cassell, who traced the origins of this conception's materialistic conception to Cartesian mind-body dualism. Rene Descartes was among the greatest thinkers of the scientific revolution, one of the greatest thinkers in the history of modern European philosophy, which he helped establish. He promoted the scientific revolution's increasingly materialistic view of nature. The stuff of nature, according to that conception, was particulate matter whose motion could be explained by the laws of mechanics. Nature, in short, this was the idea that the scientific revolution was advancing, was matter in motion. Its laws, natural laws, explained living beings whose bodies were seen more and more as machines. Pioneering figures in the history of medicine, such as Andreas Vesalius, the great anatomist, and William Harvey, the English physician, made huge advances in understanding human anatomy and physiology. Giovanni Borelli of Pisa joined other iatrophysicists. Iatro is the Latin term for physician. Iatrophysicists, doctors who were convinced that physics could account for the body's operations. There were also iatrochemists like Johannes Baptist von Helmont, who held that life's processes were chemical. Descartes' mind-body dualism was the consequence of this emerging materialistic and mechanistic view of nature in the scientific revolution. It was not at all clear how to integrate mind into such a materialistic and mechanistic conception of nature, so Descartes simply removed mind, from nature. It became a mysterious ghost in the machine. Though he did not do away with it altogether, his successors did, making the mind an epiphenomenon of the brain. To this day, that remains, shockingly, a widespread view. Already Descartes' contemporary Thomas Hobbes took the step to this type of reductionism, which is tantamount to atheism. A somewhat later thinker, the French physician Julien-Offray de la Mettrie, captured this approach in the title of his 1748 book, Man, a Machine. The preeminent physician of the early Enlightenment was Hermann Boerhaave, who held a succession of chairs at the University of Leiden. He treated the body as a plumbing system of pipes and vessels, understood in mechanical terms of forces and weights, and in hydrostatic terms of internal fluid pressures. The nature of life led to one of the intense intellectual debates of the Enlightenment. The debate was between the Mechanists and the Vitalists. The origins of vitalism can be traced to Aristotle, with his concept of the soul as the final cause or purpose or motive principle that animates living beings and gives them a degree of autonomy relative to the inanimate world. In the Enlightenment, the Vitalists were led by Georg Ernst Stahl, founder of the prestigious Prussian medical school at the University of Holland. He opposed reductionism. He thought that organisms were more than the sum of their parts. Their purposiveness gave them an inner unity and autonomy that could not be explained other than by the concept life. Stahl's vitalism, like Aristotle's, was a form of animism. Subsequent vitalists, such as the Swiss polymath Albrecht von Haller and Théophile de Bordeaux of the Montpellier Medical School, used the ideas of sensibility and irritability to express basic life forces or energies that are not material. Following upon the Mechanist vitalist debate, the term biology was introduced around the year 1799 or 1800. At issue then and now is whether biology has its own principles and concepts that cannot be reduced to the physical or chemical. My view, for what it's worth, is that it does. Life is a notoriously difficult concept to define, but I would suggest simply that it is the capacity to thrive or flourish. That life is the capacity to thrive or flourish. The inanimate world, the material world, nothing in it shows this capacity. Its movements and interactions are externally determined by laws such as gravity. By contrast, life, even in its most simple forms, exhibits a degree of autonomy and agency. It is not entirely externally determined, but has some capacity for inner determination by its inward drive to thrive, to preserve itself, to stay alive, to flourish. Certainly, this capacity has not yet been explained in physical terms, and it does not seem possible to do so without reconceptualizing what physical means. So, I would say that life is a leap of being out of the inanimate world. For this reason, the philosopher whom I have already mentioned, Holmes Roslin III, is a famous contemporary academic philosopher. I think he's a professor emeritus at the University of North Colorado. He speaks in the title of one of his recent books of three big bangs. The first big bang, of course, is the coming into being of the universe. The second is the emergence of life, and the third is the emergence of mind. Possibly the third Big Bang is less of a singularity than the first two, because mind is a very high development of the capacities for autonomy and agency that seem to be intrinsic to the nature of life itself. The 19th century was filled with efforts to explain biology, including human biology, not in vitalist terms, but in terms of physics and chemistry. In 1828, a famous experiment was conducted by the German chemist Friedrich Wöhler. He synthesized the organic substance urea from inorganic substrates, thus suggesting, presto, there's no insurmountable leap from the inorganic to the organic. This gave additional impetus to scientific, or rather scientistic, materialism. The stakes were highest in human physiology. In the 1830s, a standard work in the field appeared, Johannes Müller's Handbook of the Physiology of Human Beings. In certain respects, Müller was still a vitalist, but 4 of his proteges abandoned that remnant and embraced materialism. They were Hermann von Helmholtz, Emile Dubois-Reymond, Ernst Wilhelm von Brugge, and Carl Ludwig. In 1847, they published a famous manifesto proclaiming physiology's goal to be physico-chemical reductionism. One of their followers, Karl Vogt, popularized it in the memorable line, "The brain secretes thought, as the stomach secretes gastric juice, the liver bile, and the kidneys urine." End quote. By the end of the 19th century, scientific medicine finally began to yield great practical benefits. An essential breakthrough came with the germ theory of disease through the work of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch. Between 1879 and 1900, the microorganisms responsible for major diseases were discovered at the rate of 1 per year. Once they were identified, prevention became possible through vaccination. Microbiological research at this time, in the late 19th century, led to the creation of immunology around 1900. Antitoxin serum therapies, as in the case of diphtheria, were added to vaccines. Somewhat later, there were similar breakthroughs in pharmacology. In 1910, Paul Ehrlich announced the first magic bullet, that is to say, synthetic chemical agents that fixed or bonded to receptors in disease microbes, but not to the host. This was the famous drug Salvarsan, which was effective to a degree against syphilis. Sulfonamides, or sulfa drugs, followed in the 1930s and began to be prescribed in vast quantities. In 1928, Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin. It and other antibiotics came into widespread use beginning in the 1940s. After the advent of anesthesia and antisepsis in the mid and late 19th century, modern advances in surgery became possible and have continued at pace, driven by technology. Modern scientific medicine confronts us with a great paradox. It has led to astounding therapeutic benefits, but it has also been tethered to a materialistic metaphysics that has been the cause of enormous harm and suffering. The success of modern medicine and of modern science more generally are often used as pseudo-arguments on behalf of materialism. At its worst, this metaphysics, materialism, has taken the form of naturalistic, even zoological ideas of human nature, which radically undermine human dignity and equality, and which efface our most distinctive human qualities, which are spiritual ones. For this reason, materialism actually is an anti-human ideology, though it is often presented as a force for human progress. It led directly to the worst period of suffering in modern history, the era from roughly 1870 to 1945, which was marked and marred by social Darwinism, new forms of racism, eugenics, imperialism, militarism, world war, and genocide. Since then, since 1945, there has been less ideologically motivated human suffering, but the war in Ukraine reminds us of the potential and danger for shocking violence in our world. Medicine itself is far from immune to the dangers of ideological violence. Indeed, it may be that biomedicine is especially prone to the dangers of materialism in its ethic, maybe anti-ethic, of fighting disease at any cost, including greater suffering for the patient. Let me provide just one stark example. In the 90-year period from 1891 to 1981, an estimated 500,000 women underwent radical mastectomies, a mutilating procedure devised by the American surgeon William Stewart Halstead. During this period, there was never any clear scientific evidence that the procedure was helpful. And worse, the medical community blocked clinical studies of its effectiveness. In 1981, finally, a study demonstrated it to be ineffective, and now the procedure is almost never performed. Health Humanities offers a different approach. It can retain the therapeutic benefits of modern scientific medicine, but jettison the materialism that is the cause of so much suffering in medicine and in the broader world. The central concept of the Health Humanities is the person. That very concept and the reality behind it refute materialism and provide the resources we need for a metaphysics that is truer to reality. I will call this metaphysics spiritualism because that makes a nice binary with materialism, and because it readily suggests properties, powers, and realities which transcend the material world. Theism is also a plausible term for it, and it makes a nice binary with the inevitable atheism of materialism. What is a person? That is the title of a 2010 book by Christian Smith, a philosophically well-informed sociologist at my alma mater, the University of Notre Dame. Smith lists and describes 30 human capacities that together form the basis of personhood. His definition of personhood is worth noting. I provided it on the handout. He writes, by person, I mean a conscious, reflexive, embodied, self-transcending center of subjective experience, durable identity, moral commitment, and social communication, who, as the efficient cause of her own responsible actions and interactions, exercises complex capacities for agency and intersubjectivity in order to develop and sustain her incommunicable self.
In loving relationships with other personal selves and with the non-personal world.
Thank you.
I hate it when they put one line on the next page.
Thank you. That was perfect. Though Smith seems a little reticent to clearly identify it as such, I would argue that the essential human capacity is self-consciousness, not just sentience or awareness. Other animals have that, but self-consciousness, which only persons have. Self-consciousness develops or emerges from other human capacities, language first of all, and then conceptual thought, abstract reasoning, and rationality. It is the capacity to think reflectively about self and world. Self-conscious reflective thought involves ideals or abstract ideas that cannot be inferred, at least not directly or entirely, from the empirical observed world. Therefore, they are said to be a priori, or intrinsic to reason. They are the norms which are indispensable for making judgments and valuations. In reflective thought, we inevitably compare ourselves and the world to higher ideals, to what ought to be. The supreme ideal is the absolute or infinite. Most people refer to it as God. Other ideals include truth, the good, and beauty, sometimes referred to as the three transcendentals, plus all the other personal values, beliefs, and aspirations that make the mind more than an epiphenomenon of the brain and give it such remarkable intellectual, creative, and causal powers. Smith does not use the language of ideals so much, but he does list several human capacities that clearly rely upon them, including self-reflexivity, abstract reasoning, valuation, moral awareness of judgment, aesthetic judgment and enjoyment, imaginative creativity and innovation, self-transcendence, truth-seeking, and meaning-making. Ideals are essential to all of these spheres, and not only to reflective reason and judgment, but also to practical reason. In the German philosopher Immanuel Kant's sense of the term, that is, reason's capacity to determine the will by its own ideals. This is inner freedom or free will, the capacity for self-determination, or more precisely, ideal self-determination. Free will, as ideal self-determination, refutes determinism in the usual external sense of the term. In view of the role that ideals have both in reflective thought, theoretical reason, and in practical reason or self-determination, it might be said that persons are bearers of ideals. My argument, I hope, is clear. The ideal causal powers of personhood refute materialism and support the metaphysics of spiritualism. Persons are beings of intrinsic and exceptional worth or dignity, which is why they deserve unconditional respect and should never be treated merely as beings. And that takes me to my concluding topic, human dignity, which is of obvious great importance to health humanities. I am very pleased to see that it is part of the motto of Methodist College. The nature, sources, and grounds of human dignity have long been and remain a vexed problem in philosophy and ethics. Immanuel Kant, the modern philosophical father of human dignity, took a human capabilities approach to the problem in arguing that the source of human dignity is to be located in human nature. He located it specifically in rational autonomy or practical reason, which I just described as the capacity of reason to determine the will by its own ideals. For Kant, this capacity is what makes human beings persons, and it is the source of their dignity. Kant's idea might be put more simply. The source of human dignity, the source of personhood, is the potential to do good. Capacity-based accounts of human dignity and of personhood encounter the inevitable and formidable challenge that not all human beings have the specified capacities, and no one has them at all stages of life. These difficulties have led some scholars, such as Martha Nussbaum, the great humanities scholar at the University of Chicago, to define the requisite capabilities basically and broadly, and to ground human dignity in all of them together, and in no one of them in particular, such as rationality. Another way of getting around the difficulties of the capacity-based approach is to argue, and this is an approach that I'm fond of, that I'm partial to argue that a person's dignity consists not in him or her actually having or expressing the capacities, but rather in belonging to a natural kind, humanity, that has the capacities and is defined by them. That type of approach, the natural kind approach, we can discuss after the formal text if you're interested. Another different response to the problem of the capacity-based accounts is what Christian Smith calls divine conferral. Human dignity comes from God. It is worth pointing out that the human capacities and divine conferral approaches can be combined into something quite powerful. I have said that the ideal causal powers of personhood refute materialism and support spiritualism. So, by starting with a human nature-based approach, the capacity-based approach, we can get to divine conferral. So start with the human and argue up to the divine. Together, the two approaches, the human capacities approach and the divine conferral approach, surmount the problems of either taken by itself. So let me conclude very simply. Personhood and human dignity are at the very center of health humanities. If everyone respected them, made them the basis of their worldview, and acted on them, imagine how much less suffering there would be in medicine and in the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'm sure that you will be welcoming some questions. So I will go with the microphone. If anyone has questions.
So all of you are very attentive, and that makes delivering a lecture like this so much of a pleasure. Thank you for all of that.
I will begin with a question, what people think. So, especially about the concept of personhood. So I wonder, first of all, how much is the other important in understanding the concept of personhood? And I will explain a bit the question. So suppose I'm trying to figure out who am I? And the question itself would go to, let's say, some Aristotelian understanding, and I give an essential definition of humanity. Or I can go perhaps to a Cartesian understanding. Is it possible, nevertheless, to understand myself in connection with the other? So let's say I am Tavi, Sarah's teacher, Colin's colleague, my wife's husband, my parents' child, and so on.
Randall's friend.
Randall's friend. So how is the concept of the other important in the understanding of personhood itself? Thank you.
Thank you, Tavi. It's a very, very intelligent question. The concept of personhood, sometimes elaborated into the philosophy of personalism, is not individualism. I would respond, Tavi, that you can only understand yourself in relation to others. Personhood emerges and flourishes only in a community of other persons. So the individual, the atomistic individual, left all to his or herself, would of course be a person in the potential sense, which is enough for personhood, but that potential would not be realized, cannot be realized except in a community of other persons. So there are, you mentioned some philosophical sources of this very important idea that personhood emerges only in community. To name another is Hegel's famous concept of mutual recognition. That persons realize themselves only as persons only through a community of persons that mutually recognizes themselves as persons. So that's a very important kind of corrective to a common misunderstanding, conflating the concept of person with the concept of individual. I mean, in the West, we have the West is often taken for embracing a culture of individualism. That's rather different than personalism.
Thank you. Yes.
You talked about mastectomies being effective. You know, I've known women who've had it, they thought it saved their lives.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. You know, there's when you have cancer, it's very natural to want to do everything within your power, within the power of your care providers, to find a cure. And when physicians, up until 1981, are suggesting that radical mastectomy is effective and might even provide a cure, many patients believe that. But in fact, the situation was this. Surgery could be effective for localized small breast tumors, in which case a radical mastectomy was not necessary. But if the cancer had metastasized, then a radical mastectomy is no longer effective. It won't do any good. So this highly mutilating procedure was either unnecessary or ineffective. And that was not realized until it is estimated 500,000 women underwent the procedure. Think about what that says about the culture of medicine in that long era. What's that?
Y chromosome.
Oh. Well, I think that a culture of patriarchy does have some explanatory power. I mean, I don't want to resort to sweeping generalizations, but I think it's hard to deny that patriarchal culture had something to do with it.
Much better said than myself.
Okay, you spoke about the whole person and the body, and you referred to those in a series of different terms. But if we just step back from it and we talk about taking care of the whole person, I would think that it takes more time than just taking care of the mechanical issues with the body. And if we look at our system the way it's set up today with insurance and I don't care whether it be private insurance or government insurance, Medicare, whatever, you know, you look down through that list, you know, if you get to, you know, your itemized bill, everything is pretty much addressing the mechanical side, the body. And there really isn't time set aside or any items on there to address the whole person. And I guess, you know, as we look at this, and I tend to agree with what you're talking about tonight, you really need to address the whole person. What can be done with the system that we have today to better foster the, you know, whether it be nurses or doctors or whoever, to look at the whole person and to ensure that they actually have time and that they're paid for looking after the whole person and not just taking care of the mechanic?
Train everyone in the healthcare industry and health humanities. You speak to one very important source of dehumanization, depersonalization in modern medicine, and that's its commercialization. That profit is put above the person. And again, I don't want to overgeneralize. In some respects, American medicine excels. In other respects, it fails. And what we need to do is to identify those areas which it does very, very well, and then use the approaches of health humanities to remedy those areas that it doesn't do so well.
Thank you for the presentation. I find what you have to say very compelling. How do you integrate what we do in social science, particularly my colleagues in the back there as well? Okay, how do you integrate it into this to give an even broader perspective for individuals who are working in healthcare to understand human beings better?
Thank you, Margie, for that question. So I think one important area, I touched on it briefly, and that's cultural competence. So the social sciences can help us to understand the cultures and societies which fundamentally shape how we experience suffering and healing and disability. So that, again, the emphasis on experience rather than physical condition is not an individualistic notion. How we experience what we experience is shaped by our communities, by our cultures. And so effective healthcare rests, I said, on cultural competence. And I think that's an area where the social sciences, political science, sociology, ethnography, geography are very important. Psychology as well. There remains a lively debate as to whether psychology is more of a natural science, more of a social science, a blend of the two. But clearly, psychology is very important in the study of experience.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I was wondering, what do you think about just the impact of COVID and what the health systems have been through in terms of how that will change or has changed or does nothing to sort of that deeper understanding of like humanity in healthcare?
So that's a very broad, very complex, very difficult question, Corey. Thank you for it. Let me just touch on maybe one of the more difficult aspects of that question. At the beginning of the pandemic, there was fear. Perhaps the fear wasn't realized entirely. Perhaps the worst case situation wasn't realized. But there was a great deal of fear about the need to ration medical services, as it was anticipated that healthcare systems would be overwhelmed by the number of patients. So that forced healthcare providers, bioethicists, to need to deliberate about the criteria for rationing. And in those circumstances, where we have already failed, most bioethicists embrace utilitarian criteria. So that's, I mean, I think that's an important way of looking at it. I think from everything that I've said today, all of you would understand me to take a deontological or Kantian approach to bioethics, an approach that is sometimes referred to as principlism. But in circumstances where we have failed, most people, I think, at that point would regard utilitarianism as a viable framework for arriving at the least bad ways of rationing healthcare. But clearly the ideal is to avoid being in a situation where you have to adopt utilitarianism as an ethics of failure. So I think the one very important lesson from the pandemic is just that. Don't let ourselves enter into a situation where we have to adopt utilitarian criteria.
Thank you. Any final questions? Yes.
It's not really a question. It's just a story that hits home. This is such deep thinking. I can just imagine a conversation between you and Tavi. We were saying we would just watch it and listen. But anyway, the way I can personalize this is really interesting. I was a critical care nurse for about 6 years, and it takes that long to get very, very good at it. But I walked in a patient's room one day, and this was a patient that had been in our unit for a long time, and had a tube in everywhere you could see, breathing machine, chest tubes everywhere. And I looked at the patient, and then I looked up, and there was this picture of the most beautiful ballerina you've ever seen in your life. And there was a family member in there, and I looked at the family, I said, "Oh, is that her granddaughter?" And she goes, "No, that was her." And it literally took my breath away, and I had to change. I knew at that moment I didn't see that patient. All I saw were the tubes and the wires and that. And I knew just that self-awareness, I needed to move on into something else. But I had gotten to that utilitarian where I lost the person, and it changed, it just changed me in a way. So.
Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for your 6 years of service as a critical care nurse. I can only imagine how emotionally draining, particularly in our society, such work would be. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Randall. And thank you very much to all of you for being here. Please remember our symposium continues tomorrow with faculty from Arts and Sciences opening their classrooms to the community as well. So do come tomorrow as well. Let's thank once again our keynote speaker, Dr. Randall Poole.